Welcome to the 17th Annual Miller Lecture in Art and Art History. My name is Emma Chubb. I'm the Charlotte Fang Ford Class of '83 Curator of Contemporary Art at the Smith College Museum of Art. And it is really an honor and a true pleasure to welcome you this evening. As you get settled and silence your phones, I'm going to mention that the museum is open tonight until 8 p.m. So if anyone wants to visit the museum after the talk, we would love to see you there. And I'll also call out that on Tuesday, February 18th, we would love to see you all back here in this space. And we'll be hosting a conversation with the artist Lorraine O'Grady and the curator from Mount Holyoke College Art Museum, Stephanie Sparling-Williams, who I see, as part of programming for our current exhibition, Black Refractions, Highlights from the Studio Museum in Harlem. So by way of beginning, I'd like for us to remember that we are all on Nonotuck land, and I would like to acknowledge our neighboring indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and the Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. The Miller Lecture in Art and Art History is an endowed program established by Dr. Michael Miller in memory of his wife, Dulcie Bloom Miller, who was a member of the class of 1946. Each year, the lecture allows Smith to bring a distinguished artist or art historian to campus to deliver a public lecture and to connect with the many communities of students, faculty, staff, and Northamptonites who make living and working in this slice of Western Massachusetts so special. Tonight's speaker, Amanda Williams, joins a prestigious cohort. A non-exhaustive list of previous speakers include the artists Candice Brights, Mina Chion, and Lorna Simpson, the art historians Joseph Kerner and Anne Lafont, and an architect whose work in progress you likely passed on your way here tonight, Maya Lin. As Amanda's schedule this week makes clear, the Miller Lecture's impact extends well beyond our time together tonight. Tomorrow, she'll spend time with sixth graders at the campus school to talk about memory and monuments, including, I expect, the monument to Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm that Amanda is co-designing for the Brooklyn Prospect Park, and she'll do studio visits with several senior art majors. So, Amanda, we're so grateful for your generosity in sharing your expertise, energy, and time with us. And I'd like to extend some special thanks to my museum colleagues, especially Maggie Newey, Louise Krieger, Shanice Bailey, Janina Hall, Margie Kaplan, and Lexi Casillas for the work they've done to make this visit possible. So if I were to choose one word to describe Amanda Williams' work, it would be capacious. Denoting able to hold much, capacious can refer to a physical space, the size of this room, for example, but it can also function metaphorically. Fitting, I think, for an artist whose work holds so much and who creates space that welcomes in so many. To paraphrase my colleague, the Prospect 5 New Orleans curator Grace Devaney, Amanda transforms everyday objects and movements, such as bricks used to build a house or paths traversed on a daily commute, into artworks that prompt visual pleasure and intrigue, as well as create space for conversations about spatial justice, race, citizenship, and belonging. At the core of her work is a querying of value. How do urbanism, architecture, color, and history confer and deny value? What is the relationship of economic value to cultural and social values? Put more simply, how is value created? Who is it created by? And who is it created for? While these questions are often rooted in Chicago's South Side, where Amanda lives and works, their relevance extends well beyond Cook County. At Smith, we're fortunate to have many opportunities to learn from and with Amanda and her art. Last summer, she inaugurated SCMA's new Artist in Residence program. She spent a month living on Paradise Road and working in one of the large painting studios in Hillier, where she was assisted by Isabel Cordova, a member of the class of 2019. And now we're working on a publication about the residency, which will be out later this year. Also happening later this year, as part of the museum's SCMA 100, which commemorates the centennial, Amanda will create a multi-part site-specific commission in collaboration with students and colleagues across campus. Amanda has exhibited her work widely, including solo exhibitions at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, the Arts Club of Chicago, and the Pulitzer Arts Foundation in St. Louis. Her collaborations with artists Andras Hernandez and Shani Crow, entitled Thrival Geographies, In My Mind, I See a Line, was commissioned for the U.S. Pavilion at the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennial. A few of her many accolades include fellowships and awards from 3 Arts, the Ford Foundation, and the Joan Mitchell Foundation. She's a member of the multidisciplinary exhibition design team for the Obama Presidential Center, and, as I alluded to earlier, a co-designer of a new monument to Congresswoman Chisholm opening in New York City later this year. So we are so honored to have her here with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Amanda Williams.
Thank you. I am immensely honored to be back. I feel like I'm a Smithy. I don't know if I'll get in trouble for saying that. And I have to just say a huge thanks to Emma, who started this process probably 2 or 3 years ago. So we've been in talks about me being here for a very long time. And I feel like I'll be coming back for a very long time. So little order of business before I get started. I'm supposed to look for Camille and Kara. There they are right in the front. So I met Camille's father last week. I gave a talk at the Field Museum in Chicago, and he came up and said, I think my daughter knows you. And he's like, well, she doesn't know you, but she's gonna know you. You're gonna be talking next week. So I told him that has been my experience, not only with the generosity of the community here at Smith and in Northampton, but I'm realizing alums and extended family of the Smith community all over the country and the world. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my time here as an artist in residence, but in a slightly different way than I normally do. So Smith has taught me so many things already, but it also has been this really great way that I could re-examine my own practice and the work that I've been doing, both prior to being here and the ongoing work I'm going to be doing, in addition to the commissioned work for the campus. So I've learned terms like performative wokeness. That's a Smith term I've learned. I have my act together with pronouns. I can use they flawlessly and impress my friends. But I also was able to really think a lot about color in a very different way. So hopefully you will indulge me in thinking in real time about color in a way that I thought was new, but actually upon reflection has really been with me for a very long time. So the lecture is titled Gray Matters, and I'm going to say it in 2 ways. So gray matters, and gray matters. So most of my life has been spent thinking about color, and as Emma alluded to, its inseparability in my life as both a chroma and as a racial signifier. And so early on, I thought that architecture was the route or the vehicle through which I needed to really interrogate ideas about space and its relationship to how we assign value to people and the places that they live in based upon characteristics such as race. And so this became a diagram that I used early on in my architectural career and then later on in my artistic pursuits to really try to make sense of the way that I navigated Chicago as a landscape. So there was a love, obviously, for the iconic architecture of Chicago, but that always seemed to be for someone else and somewhere else. That was not attributed to the architecture on the South Side or in neighborhoods where people looked like me. And so Daniel Burnham and the Chicago plan and make no small or little plans was a mantra that I learned about often in architecture school, but also was kind of in the DNA and ethos of Chicago. And then Common, who's slightly older than me, but a contemporary and hip hop artist, really was the first person to illustrate in a poetic way the spaces that I was familiar with and to bring some sort of sense of value and creativity to them. So I leaned heavily upon both of these individuals to really think about what space making was going to mean to me when I thought that my life was going to be as an architect. And so I went to Cornell, and a lot of what we studied were the iconic figures in architectural history, in particular modernism. And so Corbusier was a favorite of mine, and his principles and most of his architecture were offered as a kind of standard and a kind of epitome of beauty that would extend itself in many lifetimes flawlessly because of its beautiful and excellent design. So this is a photograph of Villa Savoye from about 1958. I discovered it probably about 10 years ago and was shocked and horrified to see it in complete disrepair because it had never been presented to me in this way. And I had never imagined that buildings actually fall apart. To counter that, the South Side of Chicago is full of buildings that have fallen apart and or don't exist or are not maintained. And despite knowing better, I had embraced the idea that this was a result of poor construction or people who don't care, or don't know how to caretake. And so despite knowing that that's not true, and that couldn't be true because this is exactly where I come from, and that my own home was not like that, and that my parents were people that could caretake and appreciate beauty and value where they were and their surroundings. This was something that had been sort of baked into my educational understanding about space and value, and by extension, myself. And so it was a revelation about 10 years ago that if I could apply some of this understanding, not to the spaces that I expected great quote-unquote architecture to be in, but into the places that I expected should be great, that magic could happen, that these same principles that could make not only the value of a piece of architecture thrive, but also the extension, people's value or subscription of value to those things, that maybe that strategy could also work in these places that I saw beauty and value in as well. And so it really was an idea about what things, in relationship to color as both a racial signifier and a chroma, I had associated with in my childhood and my upbringing as not necessarily valuable in a traditional sense of good or bad, but value in terms of creating a kind of shared kinship and relationship to people that had had similar upbringings or experiences. And so I really thought a lot about what color I'd associate with products before I'd associate the form or the shape. So if you imagine that architecture is often taught in a very formalistic way, and that there's a kind of removal of both color in a technical sense, but also in a cultural sense, the kind of epitomizing of the purity of modernism and the neutral palette as an objective palette and not a subjective palette. What happens if I sort of applied the exact opposite and really thought about in an extremely subjective way what colors and associated spaces or forms had influenced my upbringing? So I developed this color palette, had no idea what I was going to do with it, but I had gotten approval from everyone who'd grown up with similar circumstances that this was, in fact, the definitive colored palette. I was quite proud of that and was going to sneak some paint chips into the Benjamin Moore store, but was challenged to actually apply this to those spaces and to think about what I'd just been speaking about. And so myself, usually my husband, who's there on the far left, trying to get the highest spot. He's 5'7", and his goal at each house was to get to the highest spot. We went around painting abandoned homes that had been slated for demolition by the city's building department, and so there's a public data portal that gives you the demolition permit to indicate that the house has been condemned, and I would cross-reference tax documents, and also foreclosure statements. And so I would select things that had literally no value to anyone at that point. So if somebody couldn't save it, a developer, some circumstance had occurred that created a situation where the house sat isolated, and in my mind, kind of anthropomorphic way, was the last kind of bastion of a neighborhood or a community. And so what would it mean at this end of this architecture's life to have value applied to it in the form of both color but cultural meaning. And so this concept, surprisingly to me, I really did not expect anyone else to care, because nobody had ever really seemed to care about these neighborhoods prior to this. And when I say no one, I'm talking about entities that have the ability to offer resources for maintenance and for community cohesion. And so it really was sort of a shock to me, and I was quite caught off guard when I was the future leader of global architecture all of a sudden, and a representative of Chicago at the first architectural biennial, and then stealing a line from my husband, who's a former athlete. It takes 20 years to become an overnight sensation. So it was just about my 20 years. All of a sudden, all of this training and thinking I've been doing actually came together to catapult me into this arena of having a platform to really talk about the convergence of these issues. And so that set off a whirlwind of about 3 or 4 years of nonstop conversations, opportunities, commissions, special projects, museum exhibitions, you name it. I was doing it and dragging my husband and my children along with me. And that's right about when Emma called and started to discuss this idea of being an artist in residence. So I thanked her and told her that was a lovely idea, but I had screaming children as we were speaking, and that it was going to be impossible for this to happen. So she assured me that she could make it happen, and I assured her she could not make it happen, and we went back and forth. And the final result was an idea that what I really needed was a kind of parenthetical moment to return back to what I'd been doing before everybody else seemed to be interested in what I was doing, which was painting. And I needed to be able to do that in a way that allowed my family to be present, but that they had to go away. They could not be there in my studio helping me as art assistants make art, which is what they like to do. And so we got this great idea that this would be a parenthetical moment, a parenthesis, a space, a cocoon, and we were gonna go for it. And I'm pleased to say that it was 100% successful, that we had a fantastic time. My daughters and my husband came. Somehow they magically were somewhere else most of the time. And then we could have leisurely ice cream walks once we finished up in the studio. But for me, it really was this moment to kind of have this cocoon to put all of the excitement and all of the kind of opportunities, but also burdens of a professional art career on a shelf, to just go back to the whole reason that I quit my job as an architect to paint and to really pursue these things that were important to me. And so when I arrived the very first time actually on Northampton's campus, I was reminded of my campus. This is Cornell University. And it was so beautiful, and it was fall, and the trees were turning colors, and it was so idyllic, and there's hills, and all these things that Chicago is not. And I was so excited to kind of relive that moment for myself, because that also was the genesis of a lot of my creative practices and kind of the development of my aesthetic hand. And then I was walking to the studio and saw this Django sign, and it made me nervous because, of course, I thought of Django Unchained. And so I texted my husband, and I was like, I don't really know what this is about. I suspect it's not a Quentin Tarantino conference. This might be music related, because it looks like a lot of people related to music, and we don't know anything, so this summer has to be about not making bad assumptions and being paranoid about people trying to get us. So he agreed, and we nodded. And then I walked a little bit further, and then I saw a Black Lives Matter banner. And I'd seen one the first time I'd come, but I'd forgotten about it, or it hadn't really resonated. And so in the summer, the campus is so quiet, and I know that this is not a historically Black college and university, so I was a little bit thrown off with the Black Lives Matter banner. So I texted my husband again, and he texted this picture back and said, "Get out." And I said, "No, we're not gonna do that. We're gonna be fine." And then I was like, you know, this is really messed up, because I just wanted to come here and just not think about anything. And even in Northampton, I'm Black. I can't get away from being paranoid about Django and Black Lives Matter banners. This isn't Cornell. And then I recalled that in 1993 at Cornell, we had a student takeover of the administration building because we were protesting the defacement of art by Daniel Martinez that had kind of blocked sight lines for the walk across the quad, and this made several students very angry, and so they spray painted Nazi signs and other epitaphs onto these black walls that he had set up about 6 feet. And you can see, let's see if I can move the mouse. You can see a little bit right here. So the top of this, he had these statements that said things like, "You cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools." And so it just became an increasing site of tension and frustration that dovetailed into us spontaneously occupying the president's office on a Friday. He was away at a Yale-Cornell game or something. This gentleman standing here said, "You people," it spiraled out of control. There were 250 of us. We refused to leave. The result was the formation of the Latino Student Living Center. So there's a commemoration every year that I didn't know about, because at one point we were all expelled, and we had to use the payphone in the lobby to call our parents, tell our parents we were expelled. Then they didn't expel us, then there was a negotiation, there was a panel, there was a team. All these things kind of ensued that were a result of this one action surrounding art, autonomy, and the ability to kind of take ownership and be valued in your place of learning. And so all of a sudden, this oddity of this banner that I didn't quite understand on this campus really hit home for me, that not only are we in moments in our personal development when we come to college where we're really trying to understand ourselves, but that the campuses and academic spaces really offer this opportunity for this kind of parenthetical moment to really think about not only your own existence, but that existence in a larger framework of things that might be going on in the world or in the history of this very special community. And so this was our Black Lives Matter. There were students coming out of the student hall with guns on Parents' Weekend. And so it's been interesting to think about how that serves as such a powerful legacy to Cornell, and it was central and pivotal to the way that obviously we operated during the '93 Day Hall takeover, but also it colored my entire experience at Cornell. But for some reason, the further away I get from it, the more the memory is the image on the right. So it's like, oh, look at the flat, look at the colors of the tree. Oh, look at the pat. Oh, don't you love Cayuga's waters? So there's a way in which I'm very interested in spending more time and thinking about Smith's community and Smith's traditions and the idea of a relationship of an act or a moment or a gesture that both defines maybe groups or your cohort's time here, but also is part of a larger cycle of something that happens in these very specialized places, which are these moments of kind of academic and personal development. And so what does it mean to hold two things in your mind at the same time? What does it mean to be impacted and affected by and to affect something like these banners that hang? And then what does it also mean to kind of embrace the beauty of the place and the history of the place with its flaws, but also its values? And so now Smith is going to become this place for me as well, and becomes a very special moment for me to think through some of those things that probably are a blur now from my Cornell experience, but are no less important. And so what does it mean also to have a phrase that both represents an organization that I'm not particularly focused on in this context, more thinking about it in terms of what it might mean to declare something in a large visual form in certain contexts, and how that can sometimes get misread or be placed out of context. And so language is something that I come back to often. I think it is because of the highly segregated nature of the South Side, growing up somewhere where space is always constantly coded and that there's a code switching that constantly goes on. But then also the idea that people of a certain age who encountered hip hop as their kind of formative music had to understand language in a way that was always dualistic and double-meaninged and simileed and metaphorical. And so I'm constantly interested in misreadings on a daily basis of language and text in particular. And so what is the tension behind these words and these terms, and also what is their power or their ability to be misread. And what does it really mean when we get into these dialogues and discussions where we can't seem to even have civil discourse anymore because there's so much rawness and hurt and tension that exists on the fore. So one statement is actually being read or reread or misread depending on who you are, based on where you come from or what your situation is or what your background is. And there's often very little time for people to take a moment, to slow down, to pause, to really think about a way in which they could meet someone halfway or in between. And so for me, I've been really lately thinking about this idea of gray and how gray can be a metaphor for that in-between, for that parenthetical moment that I was able to experience here, but also for this pause and this acknowledgement that a lot of my life has been gray. I'm Black and I'm a woman. I'm an architect and I'm an artist. The list goes on, and I'm not unique. Most of us experience these kind of dualities, or sometimes tertiary or quadruple identities, but there's very little room for us to explore what those mean, to put some of them on pause, to think through other ways that we might want to interrogate these things for ourselves personally or very loudly in public. And so for me, the summer really became an obsession about these banners, and not so much because of the organization or the phrase, but the idea, one, that they were so ubiquitous on a campus that's not predominantly Black or does not necessarily have a large Black population, but also because the hand was so present, and so there was a humanness to them and a vulnerability for me, both in knowing that this was an act that had an amount of time, materials, there was something traceable about it, but also that because the banners, many of them had been up since whatever first incident had prompted them, that they were in all states of repair or maintenance. And so at some point, they became so overwhelming that they started to be illegible to me. And so I was extremely interested in what happens if they reach a point of almost illegibility. And is there an ability then to not only see a new beauty, but to re-infuse that next level of legibility with some sort of power that the initial message was trying to infuse. And so a lot of my writings, this is a snippet from my sketchbook, really try to imagine when you get to the point where you just can't even understand what it means, or you're saying it so many times. So this is not necessarily a special technique, but it's one I thought that sort of mirrored what I was experiencing daily. And so this one in particular was probably one of the most powerful ones for me, where literally the text has literally just been washed away. And so what might that mean to think about when and if they should go away? Should it just be until they disappear? Should they be maintained? And this is a question that I also been asking of the houses that I had painted that I expected to go away, but because it's a huge city that's not necessarily very efficiently run, many of the houses are still sitting now in increased disrepair. And so what have my actions done to actually exacerbate the situation? And does that counterbalance the benefit that's come from a high visibility of the situation? And so then I began to see Black Lives Matter textures everywhere, even when they weren't there. So this is our mat to the apartment we lived in, one of the close-ups, some wallpaper from one of the residence halls, textures in the Botanic Gardens. This is Isabel. We had glorious time in the studio making monoprints and thinking about color and color theory and the mixing of colors and monoprints. And we'd say, Black Lives Matter. So everywhere we went, we could see one of the textures or one of the kind of zoomed in understandings of things. This is a visit we took to my old buddy, Joseph Albers. I talk to Albers and Corbusier all the time. So we went to the Albers Foundation and got to see the works of Albers and Joseph and Annie Albers. It was a very foggy and gray day. And so that too plays into this kind of slipping that I'm constantly doing with the word gray and the terminology, but also the idea of these spaces, these spaces of pause, or these spaces to kind of have a moment to not be accountable to one side or another, whether that's architecture or art or race or motherhood. And to really think about the grain and the beauty, both of the making and the hand of this partnership, this husband and wife, and to really think about the ways in which they both have informed, directly and indirectly, a lot of my interest in mark making, texture, and color in particular. And so it's so wonderful just to spend the afternoon. Jeanette was our wonderful host and really took the entire day and gave us so much time and generosity to really understand a lot of their individual practices and how those practices came together. And so gray in particular, for me, was kind of mind-boggling the way it oscillated between seeming to be neutral and also having color as an influence. And despite knowing and understanding interactions of color and doing fun exercises with Isabel, where we tried to recreate several of the exercises, the range in which the control of color and gray in particular just really was extremely impactful for me. And to be able to see translations and abstractions, both of architecture into paint, and then also the creation of this piece of architecture to house this work, and to have these, this is a bathroom window, these details that really speak so beautifully to that oscillation. And so I think a lot about how I already occupy these spaces of grayness, and how I would love Amy Sherall to paint a portrait of me with gray skin. I could be gray. And I think back to how it seemed totally logical to me, but everyone was up in arms when this painting first came out, that her skin was gray. My mother was not happy. It's like, this is so depressing, it's gray. It's like, it's not, it's gray. Look how she's controlled this color, you think that's brown. And to think about how then that had been infused into a lot of the work that I'd already been doing. And so this is a quote that was a prompt that I used to start a work called Uppity Negro at the Arts Club of Chicago. And so I infused the text of Sandra Bland's arrest transcript with that of Michelle Obama's graduation speech, I think, to Tuskegee class, one of the years when she was First Lady. And so each time the officer is escalating the situation with Sandra Bland, who, for those of you who don't know, was a African-American woman in Texas, a motorist who was stopped for failing to signal. And essentially, that simple act resulted in her death. So the officer escalates the situation, and I've replaced that with Michelle Obama talking about the difficult and impossible position that she was put in when she became First Lady, not because she'd run for office, but because of a choice that her husband had made, and this space that she had to occupy that that many people did not want her to occupy, or nobody had expected someone that looked like her would occupy. And so I really thought about the Arts Club is surrounded by a Misesian modernist fence, and what it would mean to deform those pickets of that fence to create this in-between space for Black women in particular, and for this banner. And so the fence starts mimicking the existing fence, and then it deforms to create a space in which there's a grayness about where it is that your body is supposed to occupy. So from the surface, it stays in line, but as you move through it actually gets out of line. And I thought that that was a beautiful spatial metaphor for basically what's been ascribed to both of these women, that they're not in their place, that they've gotten out of line for mouthing off or for occupying a position that has not traditionally been held by them. And that's Natalie Moore on the left. She's the author of the book from which I took the quote and has become a good friend. We're contemporaries. And so she likes to proudly say that she is uppity, and will let anyone know that. And so we did a reading where each of us read a component of the text. And we tried to read it as neutrally as possible, as gray as possible. It was actually really difficult and emotional to do that. And that's an image from Annie Leibovitz, I think the last photo shoot she did of Michelle Obama before she left the White House, where she's holding down the columns in the Capitol, and they had a conversation can't remember who did the article, but a conversation about how enslaved Africans had actually built the White House. So extremely powerful to kind of use that as a point of departure to think about a momentary or in-between space. And so making of spaces, temporary spaces and spaces for freedom or the freedom to do nothing, which is actually probably the ultimate freedom, led to this project for Columbia College, which is an art school in Chicago. And so we plastered Black Women Space Matters banners on the window, and it's on Wabash and Roosevelt, which is downtown Chicago. And I thought there'd be this huge backlash, and there was nothing. Nobody noticed, no one cared. But Harriet Tubman as a figure is so powerful, and I was really interested in translating the narrative of her into a structural object or potentially a piece of architecture. And so I thought a lot about what we call desire paths and what I've since learned is also called goat paths, where you cut across vacant lots. And for me, I like it because it's kind of an informal communal act in which we all traverse something, usually for a functional purpose, but in the process of doing that, the evidence or the result are these paths that then other people start to reinforce because it becomes clearly the kind of fastest way to get from point A to B. And so what would it mean if we made the Underground Railroad visible and created these kind of moments of refuge along the way, and imagining everyday women traversing spaces that potentially become dangerous or deadly through just doing basic acts. And so this is a tensegrity structure, and so tensegrity is a structural model where it's a lightweight tensile model where the more pressure is placed on it, the stronger it gets. And so I thought that was a beautiful metaphor. So it made these kind of lightweight objects that could be aggregated to create a safe haven. And then the items on the wall were from a survey. This was a collaboration with Tatiana Fazlazadeh, who did the Stop Telling Women to Smile initially, I think in Philly. So we collaborated. So she did kind of informal survey and asked people about objects that made them feel safe and secure. And surprisingly, a lot of them were domestic objects and objects that you associate with interiority. So we found that interesting despite having prompted people to think about externals. These were Black women thinking about external spaces of safety. So a lot of them had to do with their grandmother, caring for their bodies or others in terms of hair or bathing or cooking meals for people. The most interesting to me was earbuds. A lot of women said that they wear earbuds not connected to anything because that's a way to make people think that they can't hear, and then they're subsequently not hit upon or accosted or shouted at or called ugly names. So those both became precursors for the project that Emma mentioned that I did in collaboration with Andres Hernandez and Shani Crow for the Venice Architecture Biennale 2 years ago. We did a project called Thrival Geographies. In my mind, I see a line. Architects are required to always have a colon or an extra title to the title. One is not enough. And so we really did think a lot about that idea of a moment of retreat or of pause. And we combined two Harriets, in this case, Harriet Tubman and Harriet Jacobs. Harriet Jacobs is not as well known. She gained her freedom by hiding in her owner's attic. It was actually her grandmother's attic, but hiding in the attic for 7 years to evade capture and also to stay close to her children who were eventually freed. But it was a garret space in the attic, so she had to contort her body and be completely silent for most of the day, and then she could sneak out at night. She bored 3 little holes in the ground so that she could see her children. Later, her son said that he could sense that she was there, and so they would always stay in that area. It was extremely powerful just to think about the lengths some bodies have to go to just to achieve autonomy. And so we really wanted to think about what it would mean to be invited to occupy the space of the US Pavilion. So we invited Shani Crow, who's an amazing artist in her own right, but also is a powerhouse in the hair and culture industry. She did Solange's headpiece for Saturday Night Live several years ago and has worked with you name it, in the cultural and entertainment industry to create these beautiful looks. And then she photographs her models after she does these pieces. And so we used Shawnee's dimensions as well as mine to create this pod that also mimicked some of the works that she'd done and the sketches that Andres and I had been working on together to think about this space that we wanted to place in the courtyard. And then Shawnee braided paracord, which is a kind of military-grade rope that you might use for backpacks or gym shoestrings, but it has a kind of consistency of hair. And so she was able to scale up the braid work that she does to the size of this pod that we created. So in this process, we made space. These are former students of Andres and mine. So a lot of it is logistics. We don't have any money or time to come up with an entire team to create a new decommissioned piece in like 3 months. But it also was a space for kinship and for friendship and for cross-cultural exchange and growth under what was a joyous experience, but also kind of high tension, high intensity moment. Andres and I went to architecture school together, so we can kind of finish each other's sentences aesthetically and conceptually. But it really was this entire team coming together. We had to ship the frame before the braids were done because of the time frame. So there was a lot of pre-work that then had to get kind of figured out on site. And so our final proposal was that for questions about citizenship, this particular year the theme was dimensions of citizenship, and for our prompt as an individual citizen to imagine what it might mean to occupy a courtyard as an African American in a neoclassical structure that mimics Jefferson's Monticello, that in fact we don't really want to address or deal with that architecture. We want to get beyond it and we want to thrive somewhere else. So we created this bridge or this railroad, this track that loops over this loophole of retreat or this moment of retreat to get to the other side. I didn't include a picture, I forgot, but the back side of the pavilion, for those of you who have ever gone, is absolutely exquisite. It's a beautiful, lush space. It's actually not occupied by anybody, and we learned is not owned by anybody. So it sits between the United States and I think, can't remember if it's Norway or Uruguay is the pavilion just behind the US pavilion. And there's this patch of green that's not occupied. So we begged to have the sculpture there, and they said no. So instead, we just made a ladder to get you to the other side. So there's the braided work. And there's looks both up from the top of the roof and then also looking up. So we could imagine both Harriets being able to recline and look up at the stars. And this was it reinstalled at Wrightwood 659 in Chicago, which is a new cultural space on the north side. So what are the burdens of grayness and what is the privilege of grayness? And so when Lake, who's another classmate of mine from Cornell, and I were invited to submit a proposal for the Shirley Chisholm Monument as part of the She Built New York initiative that's kicking off with this as its first monument to sort of right the wrongs of the imbalance of women who are represented in New York's landscape of monuments. And to also think about that on the heels of the results of the 2016 election and the burden of Black women constantly having to be the ones that operate outside of their own best self-interest for the benefit of everyone else, and to really try to grapple with what that means to see that your counterparts, that white women, have voted for Trump. So somewhere there's some gray. I'm clear on people who are full supporters, but I'm super unclear on people who say they didn't, but somehow magically the numbers don't belie that. And so what is the burden of grayness when no choice is good, but you make the wrong one? And what is the burden for everyone else? And how do we really start to have conversations that allow us to be accountable and to make mistakes and to do different things and to say sorry or not and to own that ability to not have to have an opinion, to not have to do something that's uncomfortable, to not have to do something that operates outside of your own best self-interest. And so a lot of that was at the fore of Lake and I really thinking about the space we wanted to create for Shirley Chisholm, who was about inclusivity, but also was about everybody needing to have their seat at the table, and not just to be included, but to be accountable. And so this sculpture that we've created is an intersection of one of her most iconic of images of her, crossed with the silhouette of the US Capitol, and then the ground is inscribed or kind of carved out, mimicking the layout of the congressional seating. And so really to think about what it means to carve out space. As Lake likes to joke, we're not really good at making bronze statues. So what we know how to do is make space, and we can make anticipatory space, because these are conversations that need to happen and are going to happen in some form. And this is what better tribute to her than to have this be something that happens kind of under her watchful eye. And so we love the idea that from a distance, you can see it's Brooklyn, so you gotta be wild. So it's yellow and green. From a distance, you can make out that it's her. But as you draw closer, the scale of it is so monumental that you can't take it all in. And so all you can do is kind of be in community with other people in that moment. And so that's really important for me to think about constantly, both making space for myself, but also making room to have these conversations that are often difficult. And so in realizing that I've always been making space for greatness, one more project, actually might skip this one. This is the Museum of Contemporary Art, and I was invited to do a show shortly after the visibility of color theory went national and international. And so what does it mean to bring that, the difficulty of the conversation of what happens in these Southside neighborhoods into a space like the Museum of Contemporary Art? Apologies, this is a little bit blurry, but these are some young people that came to the museum to see the show, and I had a pretty adamant rule that I never told the address of where the houses were, because if it was that important, either you knew that landscape or you needed to go investigate it to find the houses. And so it was like one of these moments of sobbing when these teenagers come into the museum and they know exactly where these houses are. And so for them in that moment to feel like that space was for them, or that exhibition was for them, was extremely powerful. And we'd done an experiment to invite some residents of Inglewood, which is the neighborhood most of the houses were painted, to come to gild a small room that was the size, a scaled down size of a typical Chicago parcel. And they, during the run of the show, were the only ones with access to the space to really talk about what it might mean to privilege this parenthetical moment. I didn't call it a parenthetical moment at the time. This gray space, this gilded gray space that allowed questions of privilege and access to be at the fore of the museum. And to also dedicate quite a bit of my real estate that I've been given for this exhibition to a box. This is a project from last winter at the Smart Museum, where I wanted to talk about redlining, and I'm very serious, but I'm also very silly, so I literally was like, I think we should just put red lines on the floor. So we painted the fissures that are in the travertine of the museum's lobby. And as I'm realizing I often like to do, bringing together people from very disparate backgrounds, but all stakeholders who are invested in a certain subject matter to come and sort of have a knitting circle, basically. So in this picture, there's museum staff, there's City of Chicago Planning Department staff, the former mayor's wife, First Lady Amy Rule, came to help. She brought her daughter. I made my mother paint, that's her with the red on. High school students, just a cross-section of somebody who lost their home. So just a cross-section of people who this subject matter impacts, to be able to have a conversation in very temporary terms, but in non-threatening environment that really allows for dialogue or serendipity to happen in a way that doesn't necessarily happen in the more formalized structures. And so for my project here at Smith, I'm really interested in those ideas of making that space for greatness and making room for those conversations, but also thinking back to my time at Cornell and how the tensions and the emotions were so raw, and we left there with invaluable lessons, but there never was a moment to think about bringing closure for yourself for something that lingers in a literal sense and a conceptual sense, and also how you memorialize something that you know is going to continue. What are the things that art can offer, or artistic gestures can offer in that capacity? And so I thought a lot about the lines that are on campus and the way bodies move through space and ways to highlight or accent that and have these conversations informally and also spatially in sort of coded landscapes and dialogues. And so this is going to take many forms, some of which will be about pathways, some will be about reimagining, using the banners to reinfuse them, or their forms to send new messages that will be on the exterior and some interior spaces of the museum, and to also think about where we might want to insert moments to have difficult conversations, what traditions already exist in which these kinds of things could happen, and what new traditions or new communal and temporary acts could occur to really help the Smith community, both present, past, and future, think through what they want to be as a community, but also what this will mean for helping people think through who they want to be beyond this place. And so it's invaluable to have an amazing collection, one of the most amazing collections I've ever seen, and to also think about ways to translate value between these historic art images, but also real-time elements that exist on the campus in a much more subtle way. I won't go into it, but I'm exploring tulips quite a bit and was quite intrigued with a campus with a botanical garden sitting in the middle of it. So thinking about the tulip bubble and tulip mania of the 1600s, and tulip as a commodity or something that gained kind of astronomical value and then didn't have it suddenly. And so tracing that and researching that through art history and photography and painting, but also thinking about motifs of flowers and how that could translate or become code for a kind of present day expansion. So I'm going to end with this slide. This is the beginning of something, who knows what it is, but there are two ways that I've been thinking about achieving gray. So one is black and white, which is binary, and lends itself to thinking in polarities. The other is through chroma. So for those of you who are lovers of Photoshop, if you move your wand to the same point, this is how you control warm or cool grays. But you can get gray from a productive strategy of a triad or a three. And so I like the idea of imagining what kind of gray spaces we make when we use this as a metaphor, and not the one that we've all come to kind of subscribe to in terms of black or white, binary, and also perceived as neutral. In that neutrality, it doesn't offer other room for otherness that goes beyond race, gender, class, socioeconomic status. So this is where I'm ending this talk, but this is also kind of where I'm starting to begin with both the work that I'm going to do here and future work that I'm going to be doing, and really thinking about how my blackness is inflected with a kind of productive grayness. So with that, I say thank you. Right on time. It was telling me to be quiet. Like, computer shut down. Okay. Oh, this was my favorite one. This is my favorite banner. So I thought I would end with that. So I'm happy to take questions.
Hi, Amanda. My name is Alice, and I'm a sophomore here at Smith. I just decided this year that I will be studying architecture. Woo! I just wanted to know what your experience was doing the actual architecture type part of the field, and why you decided that that wasn't for you.
Great question. So I graduated and actually moved to the Bay Area and practiced architecture for about 6.5 years. So I like to say it's the extension of the birth lottery, but I got the job lottery, because I graduated at the height of the economy. And I know that's like unfathomable for you all who probably weren't even born then, but literally they're like handing out jobs at the airport. So not only did I get a great job, but there was like more money than I'd ever was $30,000. So it was a magical experience because at that moment, the tech industry was like, Google wasn't born yet, right? So there was all this money and nobody quite knew where it was coming from, and it was being spent on campuses and luxury this and, imagine that. So I entered the workforce at a time where my school experience was very much like my work experience, which we've been warned was not gonna happen. We were gonna do toilet details, we were gonna do roof copings, we were not gonna make campuses. Carly Fiorina had just taken over at Hewlett-Packard, and so they were gonna have this thing called smart devices, and we're like all laughing. It was like, so one thing is gonna turn your coffee machine on, and you're gonna get a car, and you can pay from your bank account. That's never gonna happen. So we had to make this innovative space for them to imagine what that would be like, and make up this stuff. I mean, those are the kinds of projects that I got. So I feel like it also was like this accelerated fast track because I was doing every facet of design. And so there came a moment where it was like, it can't get better than this. And actually, it was my boss. I worked for a woman-owned firm, Simon Martin Vagey Winkelstein Morris. And my boss, Kathy Simon, said, if you could be doing anything right now, what would you be doing? It's like painting. And so she was shocked. She thought I was going to say, working for you or doing architecture. And so they couldn't keep up with like the bonuses that the tech companies were giving. And the tech companies were poaching everybody, not just in-house counsel, but they had in-house architects and in-house this. And so they would give us sabbaticals for creative endeavors. So I took mine to make a painting series, and I never went back. And so I was really worried about this, and thought my parents would cry all this time and money they put into me, and now I'm gonna run off and be an artist, and I could have done that without going to school. And they were so supportive. They were like, duh, we knew you were gonna do this. So it really was great to kind of have that reinforcement, but I think I attribute 100% the artist I am to the architectural training that I received. And I like to say that I'm still an architect. So when I talk about that grayness, I sort of make elbows for the fact that the way that I think about space is critical and necessary and missing in the architectural profession. And you see it in recent years with the kind of excitement or being invited to the Venice Biennale, all these kind of absurdities to me based on the way we were trained. And so I see it as my luxury and burden to be able to cross back and forth constantly. So space really is a medium as much as color. So I'm glad that you've chosen architecture. We need you. There's still less than 500 women ever licensed, Black women licensed as architects ever. So you've got to up that ante. So stick with it, enjoy it. Call when it's too hard and you want to cry. Right now. Yes, why are you here? You should be in the studio.
Okay. Hi, Ms. Williams. Thank you for your talk. I don't think you specifically mentioned the word decolonization, but to me, and because I'm a world literature major, and right now I'm studying post-colonial literature and decolonizing language, to me, it looks like a lot of your work is part of a process of decolonization, and that work, like especially of your houses and all the different colors and the painting, and I thought that was really powerful, and I was wondering if you would speak to that.
To that work in particular, and the idea of decolonization just in general?
Yes.
So I think, so a lot of my time in architecture school was spent obviously thinking about that, and it was the first time that concept was ever presented to me, but it seemed so ubiquitous to my complete existence on the south side of Chicago, growing up in such a segregated landscape. And so a lot of time was spent trying to make sense of how to get my brain around that as an architecture student at the same time that I'm trying to make work that undermines that. So it's incredibly difficult. And in hindsight, there were instructors there who wanted to help but could not help. And so it was difficult, and I think that's what that 20 years was, right? That there was an absence, or there was no one there to help make that bridge in real time. And much of the resources and information we had was literature. So it's extremely difficult already to be coming into a major where your language now is lines. So now you have to learn a whole nother language that's lines, and you're trying to translate information that you are receiving on your own from literature into space and form. So there's a lot of crying, but a lot of, and so that's why I mentioned hip hop, right? Because I just lucked out that was the moment in which that's happening. And so there's a lot of trying to take very complicated theory and turn it into form. So that slide that I showed at the very beginning, this idea of trying to map kind of one understanding onto a thing. And so that really was that breakthrough. And so I think it resonated because people can read very complex, kind of multiple years of trying to work out ideas about being colonized, and then seeing a way through, or seeing something that helps you think about a kind of strategy. So I don't know. I don't think it was it wasn't conscious during the work, but it was because it had been so many years of trying to figure out how to translate these things, and then at some point giving up and being like, well, it's not going to work anyway. But then having that sweet spot where now that work can become a reference point for other people trying to explain it, or explain some of the more complicated nuances of literature or philosophy into space, into form. So I don't know if that answers what you were getting at, but does it help?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing your work. I'm wondering if you could give us a bit more of a sense about how you started your studio time here at Smith, in that it seems to me that it can be challenging to enter into that blank space. And if I'm understanding the way you're framing your thinking now, that in-between time and that in-between experience gave you the chance to reflect on gray matter, which has become this really powerful framework for a whole bunch of ways of thinking about space and ideas and images. So I'm wondering if you could talk some about just the specifics of your studio day,
yeah.
but then also, how did you make the connection between that parenthetical month and then this whole framework that has evolved, or that you highlighted? Not that it's new, but that it gave you a fresh vantage.
Well, it felt new until about a month ago, 2 months ago. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, and that part, and that part, and that. So literally. I have a beautiful studio, which I think is a whole classroom. It's probably usually multiple students in the art school. And so I knew two things. To your point, is it's impossible to be creative in some assigned time frame. So despite promising that I was not going to try to force anything that was just going to be, of course I had a list, and I was like, okay, so the first week, and if that's successful, then the second week. But built in there was like taking naps on the lawn in front of the student center, but I went back to actually architecture school, and the assignments that we would have as kind of a warm-up or an exercise or a prompt, which was to make collages. So every morning I'd make a collage for about 10 minutes. And then as it expanded, they got longer and longer, or I'd make more than one. But it was just a making. So just to kind of return to a joy of making with no pressure for the making. I still put pressure on there, but that was the kind of goal and intention, and to just be open to thinking about paint. So Isabel and I just like mixed colors for like 3 days. It's like, look at that. Mm-hmm. And then we started cataloging it. So we just do basic things, like returning back to the alphabet almost, and just getting back into a routine of eating, sleeping. We purposely didn't have a car or a television, so when it got dark, it was time to go to sleep. We'd go to the grocery store and get whatever we needed for that day. So all of these things that on the one hand seem like mundane, but have become luxuries in a sense of a very rapid, busy life. My husband's a small business owner as well. So it was really good, and to really have a partner that respects. He played in the NFL, and so I think to have somebody that had achieved, I didn't know him at that moment in his life, but to have achieved a kind of unimaginable goal based on your surroundings, he's just very protective and supportive of the idea that you need time. And so he also was kind of like putting the elbows around. So while he's also texting me right now, literally, and sort of nagging me all the time, he understands. So there's not the hurt feelings or the, so that was invaluable also, to just have, as best as possible in that scenario, somebody that's really letting you kind of make that gesture. And then from that, I was able to just do things that didn't have to have an end. And so then I had the rest of the summer and the rest of this time to really reflect on what might have seemed like a very short amount of time, but was so profound because I hadn't had it in probably a decade. And so it really was just like having a few things that were about getting back into a ritual and a routine that actually could continue when I got home again. It's like, it's just Tuesdays now. It's not a whole month, but Tuesdays are Smith. So my studio is, we joke, it's like, today's Smith. So it's like, that's the time to kind of go back to that behavior. And then it did take kind of that marinating or that digesting right before you sort of see the connections and you're realizing you're making some references. And Isabel was amazing. She's an amazing human being and a great assistant, but she also is an ace researcher. And so I would ramble something, and then she'd come back the next day with like 15 or whatever I'd seen. I'd like, I wonder how many songs. And then she'd just come back with books, or she'd catalog something, or she'd summarize. And so I've actually hired her since, and so she continues. She's in Japan right now, but she lives in Hawaii. But I've, because she's able to continue those dialogues with me because she remembers that moment. So that too is invaluable as that bridge to things that happened that I maybe didn't think were that big of a deal or important, that now are literally becoming the kernels for new bodies of work.
Thank you, Amanda. That was such an interesting talk. I was struck this time when I was looking at all of the pieces that you've been doing, actually for quite a while, since the houses, that everything is collaborative. You think of art making as being often an isolated individual experience, but even talking about Isabel's role, you were supposedly taking this time for yourself, but you spent a lot of time today talking about your collaboration with Isabel. So could you talk about how collaboration works for you in the process of art making? Yeah,
lots of people have asked that, and I guess I never thought of it like that, and I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if it's like, it's more fun when there's other people, or, I don't, somebody described it in an introduction as the ambition of the works are not capable with two hands. And so I'm always thinking of something that's massive, but I do think that somewhere in there is also the idea that isn't it much better when it has to be a lot of people, because you have to negotiate. There's no way to do that. And it's actually quite difficult now that there's an expectation that I'm making art objects as part of an art economy, that it gets very complicated because I'm constantly arguing then that, well, no, you have to split that 3 ways. Well, no. And so that's highly unusual that somebody's going to be that generous. And so it's just a headache for galleries and museums, and right, because it's fair. It's the way it should be. But I think for me, especially with the work that has to do with community engagement, it's very difficult if you're not from a community, whatever community you're engaged in, right, to be operating individually. Like that's probably where I think personally architecture gets it wrong most of the time, and a lot of other socially engaged work gets it wrong, where they kind of have an idea and then they go in somewhere. And so I'm much more interested in communal actions. So if you can get a group of people together for 30 minutes to all do so-and-so, no harm, no foul. You know, the commissioner of planning is painting nail polish on the floor of a museum. You know, he is directly responsible for the housing issues in Chicago, right? And we can have a very real conversation on the floor in the museum. You know, so who knows if it changes anything, but it's just a moment to kind of activate something very differently than if we went and, you know, sat in Day Hall. If we went and rushed the city hall and told them what they're gonna do, which is necessary too. So I'm down for that. I don't do that anymore, but I'm down for that. But there's these other ways to extend that or to kind of grow. So it's just, I never realized that that's what I'm doing. It's just always an integral part. And we've baked it into the commission here, that there will be students that's already built into what the work is going to be. And then obviously I'm thinking collectively in terms of what does this community want as tradition, as space for conversations about things that are difficult. So that seems much more effective than a statue, which I can't really do anyway with a statue. So I don't know. I don't know where that comes from, but you are correct. That's almost part of every single project.
Hi, thank you again for coming here and speaking to us about your work. So being an outsider, I've moved here from Seattle, and I'm curious about how it's also obviously a very different demographic here than it is in Seattle, and it's a very different demographic than it is in Chicago. And I wonder what your experience is in trying to come up and make a piece in an area where typically there's really not a lot of diversity. So aside from the campus necessarily, if you literally step outside of the campus, the diversity basically plummets. So I'm curious about how that factors into your piece that you are commissioned for the college, and who you're addressing and how you're addressing.
So I would say the piece is probably really trying to address the Smith community. So I didn't try to take on kind of the whole region or all of Northampton and thinking about it. I really did think specifically about the students and the students who would have a tangential relationship to these banners, which will at some point go away. But they'll be very similar, I realized, to my time at Cornell and Day Hall. It's like, they have a commemoration every year. What do they do? There's plaques, our names are, you know, like all these things I didn't have any idea. And so that became very interesting to me, to think about this as a type of place as opposed to a geography that has these issues that I probably would need to live here for several years to really get into. I will tell an interesting anecdote. So my husband, as I mentioned, was here, and he had to like go away all day. So he's an avid researcher and reader. So he has this bright pink highlighter. He's very dark skinned. He's very buff. And so every day I'd have people say, I saw your husband today. I saw your husband today. And he's like, because I'm a unicorn. So he was intrigued and fascinated by, not that we were surprised. I mean, we knew kind of what the demographics would be. And there wasn't really even a concern about that. But he was like intrigued by how many people were sort of baffled, but also attempting to seem welcoming. So it was very strange to him, because in Chicago, no one cares and they don't welcome anywhere. So it's like, it was just a very surreal kind of landscape and environment. So we had a lot of conversations about diversity, not so much in the lack thereof, which I could see might be tense or difficult if this is where you're calling home, but because we knew we were not staying, it almost becomes like this kind of laboratory, right, to think about larger questions of diversity, and also what does it mean to be liberal, and what does it mean does that mean tolerating things, and do you get to just be liberal about the stuff that you feel comfortable about being liberal about, or what does that mean? So he and I would have tons of conversations about reactions to him throughout the day, and I'd be talking about, you know, rose green or something. I don't know, like some color I'd made up, right? And he's like, There was a guy in Starbucks, and he wanted to know what I was reading, and everybody keeps commenting on my pink highlighter. Why do you think that is? You know, so it was very, very interesting. But we didn't really come expecting the like racial diversity. So. And I think we operate in Chicago like that. We live on the South Side. We chose to live on the South Side, still very segregated. But we moved through the whole city. So I think it just wasn't present. We just had kind of accepted that this was what it was going to be. But that's a very interesting question to think about. How might the commission impact the larger area? I don't know if it will, because that probably has something to do with the way the college is kind of situated in relationship to not only Northampton, but the whole region, which we didn't know very well. So I know that doesn't really help. And I know coming from Seattle, it's very different. But yeah, so we had conversations, but it wasn't really, we kind of accepted it as a given when we came. It probably would have been different if we were moving here to think through how we were going to navigate that. That's it. Thank you, guys.